Well, my next guest is one that I am extremely intrigued with, because at our own church we have just gone through somewhat of a metamorphosis, because as I was telling Brother Perry Stone earlier, there was a time where I was that 20-year-old preacher over there in that crazy metal building on the other side of town, and so I had a church full of what I was like. Well, I turned around a couple of times and I was the 40-year-old man, and everybody in my church was my age. And so now I had to intentionally go back and get what I promised God I'd never lose, and that's the next generation. That's my children. And so we've got a brother here that feels called as an itinerant, traveling speaker to the postmodern generation, which is my children, your children, and actually that 18 to 30 crowd. They are different than any other generation we have seen on the face of the earth, and it's going to take something special to be able to reach them. This brother describes himself as a postmodern pastor, full-time speaker at over 500 venues to 250,000 people across the country each year, the author of many books. I want you to welcome with me Brother David Edwards. It's good to see you tonight, brother.
Thank you, Pastor. It's good to be here.
I'm so excited about having you. You know what? I'm going to get started because I want to hear you talk.
All right.
I want to hear you talk. You may even see me over in the corner. If the camera will go on you, I just may be dribbling some stuff down on my hand tonight. Because you know what? Every pastor is probably great. I don't want to use the word fear, but something that can cause him great anxiety is how to not let the church grow old with him.
Right.
And most churches, Brother David, do not transition well. Right. Churches do not transition well as a norm. That's why most churches are one-generational.
Right.
One generation has a great revival, and then they don't let the next generation touch God with their own song. And I've always told people that my kids are not going to touch God with my song. They have their own sound. And we are in the process of making sure that we don't lose the next generation.
That's right.
I know Perry began to speak into this quite a bit, and you're just going to just, you know, kind of backpack on what it was he said.
Right.
But talk to us about this generation, your own testimony, and maybe give a pastor out there some hope.
All right. Well, you know what I begin to see is I know most of us are probably familiar with the stats that 85% of high schoolers, that once they leave the church, once they graduate, they never come back to church. And so I was, you know, I've been on the road for about 17 years or so, traveling and speaking, and I began to go to churches that had great student ministries, and after that there was this big blank window, this void,
this gap,
and this gap where young adults are leaving. So I've really spent the last probably 10 years of my life figuring out how you connect truth with those young adults, and I think a lot of it has to do with, once again, our faith has to be engaged in what we're doing. I mean, young adults can tell when senior pastors and Sunday school teachers are just phoning it in. They can tell when it's not real. And I know that there's been a lot of emphasis placed on lights and smoke and all that kind of stuff.
Lasers and everything.
But you know what? You know what the real ingredient is? Jesus.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be over spiritual. I'm not trying to be preachy, but I'm just saying I don't know of one church that doesn't want to have young adults in their church. Right. But I'll tell you this, every young adult needs Jesus.
Yes, yes.
They need the life of Christ. And, you know, I think for me, I'm passionate about it because I really have lived the story of that generation. I'm not in it, but I've lived that story. They're the most divorced generation of all time. They have the most, they carry the most secret shame than probably any other generation I know of. And that's kind of my story in a lot of ways. My parents were divorced when I was 5. I went to divorce court, watched my parents fight it out, and I didn't know what was going on. I was only 5. I thought it was a game show, you know. Right. Because my mom got a house and a car, my dad got some luggage, and so I never really, so proud the crowd's with me. Yeah. And so I never really knew my dad as dad. I just knew him as the defendant. And so after he left, I didn't see my dad again until I was 21. He dropped off the radar screen of my life, and so my mom became a single parent, which most young adults have grown up in some kind of family dynamic that was not normal to them. And so my mom being a single parent meant that she had to play both roles. So anytime I got in trouble, my mom would be like, "You just wait till your father gets home," then she'd go, "I'm home." It's like, oh my gosh, that's great. And so I was really raised by my mother and my grandmother, and I know we got a lot of grandparents that are watching that love the grandkids. Yeah. And my grandmother was a mall walker, so I didn't see her a lot. She started walking 5 miles a day when she was 60. She's 85 today, and we don't know where she is. And so if you see her, send her home. And I got right before you start middle school, and I started to struggle with school. I mean, I couldn't do the work, I couldn't do the classes, and I just kind of grew up being told by all these experts that I wasn't bright, and I wasn't smart, and so you have enough adults tell you things like that, you just start believing.
Yeah.
So we have a generation that have grown up hearing a lot of crazy things that adults should never ever say to kids, and it has really hijacked their headspace in a lot of ways. And so they finally ran some tests on me and found out I wasn't stupid after all. Yeah. The crowd's laughing. And that's all right, that's fine. But they thought I had a thing called dyslexia, which means when you read, you see letters and numbers backwards. So everything in my life was reversed. I'd, go upstairs to play, go outside to do my homework. So everything was backwards, and which made it difficult for me to be, I wasn't a really wild teenager because I couldn't even shoplift right because I'd go home and get something to bring it back to the store. So everything in my life was reversed, and when they found out I had dyslexia, they took me out to this normal school, put me into this place called Crayola College, which is a school for slow learners, and all this time, let me tell you what my mom was doing. She was taking me to church. She got me into the place, even though I grew up without a dad. I was in a church that had a lot of strong, godly men, like what Perry was talking about, where there were men that became the male covering of my life and spoke a blessing into my life. And my church was, notorious for having spring revivals, and they'd bring in, brother so-and-so. So I kind of grew up in that world, and on a particular Sunday morning, they had a guest speaker come in, and who was a yo-yo guy, not like yo-yo, not like that, but like a yo-yo with the string. And this guy starts flicking out yo-yos and striking matches with it, and I don't really even know how yo-yos and Jesus connect. I'm on the back row going, he can walk the dog, Jesus must be real. Yeah. And and so I don't really know how that connected. And so but this guy got to the end of his show, or whatever you call it, and he said something that changed my life. He said, you know what it means to be a Christian? He said, it means there's been a time where Jesus himself has stepped out of heaven and stepped into your heart. And because of that moment, something different's taken place on the inside of you. Wow. And there I sat without a dad, with my mom carrying the load of both people and working 2 jobs to make ends meet. And I felt like the older I was getting, the harder life was becoming. And that morning I realized that Jesus was more than a song, and more than a story, and more than a sermon, and more than a skit, but that he indeed was the Savior. And that the life he had.
Yes. I want to ask you something. And I appreciate the transparency in sharing your testimony. And I don't know how transparent you want to get, but now our church kind of patterns itself after going after the underdog. Right. We're huge into inner city ministry and trying to go after our city's most troubled groups and doing everything we can to raise the standard of living. The fatherlessness. Right. I've seen people weather it pretty well, and I've seen others where it's devastating. Yes. What effect? I know you found some men that could be mentors, but there's still a difference between a mentor and a father. That's right. What effect did it have on you as a pastor trying to minister to a generation of fatherless people? What effect did that have on you? Could you just be a little more transparent about that? Yeah, I'll tell you, because having, growing up in a broken home, I heard all that stuff about, kids that come from broken homes end up with, high-powered rifles and just all that. I've heard all that crazy stuff. And I'll tell you something that I really hung on to. And even when I did 10 weeks of student camps this summer, I've spoken to almost 30,000 people in the last 10 weeks. Most of them young adults, and either living without a real father or in some sort of weird blended situation. And I'll tell you the thing that helped me get through it was that I memorized a verse out of Psalm 68, verse 5, which says that God becomes the father to the fatherless. And I'll tell you what that... Yeah.